I hope you're having a good day. This is Nathan Brummel. Today we begin to have a second look at Calvin Seerveld and his philosophical aesthetics. Last time we had a little bit of an introduction to his life, and now what we do is we begin to have an introduction to his thought and his writings. Now, his most important writings include his book about rainbows for a fallen world, but his first written publication was Benedetto Croce's earlier aesthetic theories and literary criticism that had the subtitle A Critical Philosophical Look at the Development During His Rationalistic Years. This was Calvin Seerveld's doctoral dissertation that he wrote at the Free University in Amsterdam. And this study was of Benedetto Croce, who was an influential Italian thinker on matters of aesthetics. And it looked at especially his early years, which were 1900 to 1915. Now, there are a couple of other books that grabbed my attention when I began looking at Seerveld's thought. One was A Christian Critique of Art, and then that brought me to his A Christian Critique of Literature. These books were published lectures after he gave the annual Unionville Study Conference for the Association of Reformed Scientific Studies in the years 1962 and 1963. So these were the beginnings of Seerveld's attempt to develop a Reformed Christian aesthetic. Now, his fourth book, which built on these writings, was his Rainbows for a Fallen World, with the subtitle Aesthetic Life and Artistic Task. This book was published in 1980. Now, Rainbows is a more systematic development of his views, and it's an attempt for him to be practical, to apply matters of aesthetics to real concrete situations. This book has important chapters on Christian art, what is the fundamental nature of art, and other important topics in aesthetics. And he also, in line with his philosophical and Dutch Reformed philosophical tradition, develops the concept of modal aesthetics. Now, we want to look at some of the ideas that Seerveld teaches in these books. Now, what is his main agenda? Well, his main agenda is to develop a Reformed Christian philosophy of aesthetics. His secondary aim is to promote the arts and literature in the Christian community, so that Christians would see the value and importance of art and literature. The danger in the Dutch Reformed community is that people think that any work or anything you do has to be productive, it has to make money, and therefore art was sometimes given short shrift. Of course, historically, fathers freaked out when their sons decided they wanted to become artists, or if they wanted to be litterateurs, or even philosophers. And so Seerveld wants to deal with this issue. Why should Christians value things like paintings? And he, along with other neo-Calvinists, argued that a Christian aesthetic was important because he thought that it had the potential to transform culture. Now, before we right away get all fearful of this type of language of transforming culture, I think we can say we don't need to be triumphalistic when it comes to these matters. I think in little and small ways, as Christians, simply engage in culture, that is, engage in the work of taking God's creation and having dominion over it, whether that's with a paintbrush, or whether that's with a song, or whether that's with cooking a lovely meal. In all of these respects, it is true that how Christians act and how they conduct themselves can have an impact on other people. Seerveld is correct, certainly, in thinking that the arts and literature play a big role in shaping the minds of a culture. Now, in America, we might not think that, but on the other hand, notice the role that movies and general pop culture plays in politics, for example, in America. That is why some conservatives have thought that in order to battle against a liberal agenda, what they need to do is they need to be involved in cultural issues and in issues of the arts and documentaries and things like that. Now, if you had asked some people in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union what role literature played in that, they would probably tell you that Russian literature has played a role in the history of Russia. So Seerveld is correct in thinking that the arts and literature are in fact relevant things that in fact even shape the minds of a culture. And therefore he thinks that Christians and the Christian community should be involved in the arts. We will look at why he thinks that the arts are important, and we'll be introduced to his idea that art is worship and what he means by that and what the potential problems might be with that formulation. Now, it might seem surprising that one might even have to argue for the importance of the arts for society and the Christian community. Seerveld thinks that the Christian community has shied away from the arts for a number of reasons. One, he thinks, is that secular thinkers have dominated in certain areas of the arts, and therefore Christians have been shy to be involved. Sometimes secularists seem to be the persons who are the gatekeepers in the arts, and therefore they can keep out those who do not agree with their agenda. Seerveld reacts to this anti-artistic mood in the Reformed community by arguing for the importance of art for the Christian life. And he does this in two ways. First, he makes the surprising statement, art is worship. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he says, art telltales in whose service a man stands, because art is always a consecrated offering, a disconcertingly undogmatic yet terribly moving attempt to bring honor and glory and power to something. Now, if art is worship and is made as a gesture of service and honor to someone or something, well, then that makes art quite important. Now, of course, one problem with the use of the language that art is worship is that the danger is that you stretch the idea of worship far beyond its normal meanings. For example, we can do the same thing when we say all of life is worship. Someone might say all of life is worship, and therefore I don't need to gather with the saints publicly to worship God on Sunday, because I can worship God as I fish. Well, then there's a problem, because of course we do distinguish between what we call liturgical worship and the fact that all of life is to be lived for the glory of God. Now, what does Seerveld mean, though, when he says that art is worship? Well, some art seems on the very face of it not to be an attempt to bring honor or power or glory to anything. For example, sometimes it seems that art is made just for aesthetic delight. It seems intuitively plausible, at first anyway, that we could create art that doesn't honor anything. Maybe you're just doing something just for the pure fun of it. Well, Seerveld would respond to objections like this by saying that what we are honoring is that we're not honoring anything. Seerveld would claim that even in a work of abstract art that's made for just the perception it gives, which doesn't seem like a very worshipful reason, we're still honoring something, namely the specific perception we have chosen to portray. Seerveld also seems to be stretching what we mean in ordinary language by the word honor until it has such a broad meaning that it no longer has connotations we normally attach to it. It will seem more palatable to think of art as worship when we consider later what Seerveld takes Christian art to be. If his conception of Christian art involves the idea that art must be ideological, then it is generally more reasonable to see why art might be worship. This is because ideologies can be understood as worldviews or religions in the general sense, and the concept of worship does fit in the context where ideologies are religious. The second reason is important for the Christian community to engage in art, according to Seerveld, is that art influences not only the Christian community, but also the majority secular culture, at least in countries like the United States. He argues that secular culture is in a bad way, and that Christian cultural influences can potentially change this by having an effect on culture. He does seem to be quite triumphalistic at times. He says, speaking of how contemporary people are suffering in their secular culture, what hurts people most, he says, I suppose, is not that God and the church are dead, but because God and the church are dead to the world, there has inevitably come an all-encompassing, frustrating loss of order. Seerveld thinks that to counteract our troubled culture that involves irrational and unhappiness, Christian artists can use their gifts in order to turn back this tide and to give people hope. It is interesting that in line with Abraham Kuyper, he says that art is a battlefront. Notice this antithetical language. He says that art is a battlefront and perhaps the most vulnerable and influential one since it catches people at ease. In other words, people are influenced as they're enjoying themselves. He quotes Abraham Kuyper, who was the influential Reformed theologian and Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who said at the turn of the 20th century, "Art is no fringe that is attached to the garment, and no amusement that is added to life, but a most serious power." Christian art will play an apologetical role for Christianity that promotes Christian culture and attempts to change the faulty ideologies of a given society. Now, in order to understand Seerveld's positive views, we need to look at what he's responding to. What are some aesthetic ideas that Seerveld rejected? Now, Seerveld rejects Roman Catholic art and what he calls pseudo-Christian art. He is justified in rejecting them because he has a novel theory of what Christian art should be, and these types of art fall short of his definition of Christian art. Another concept we have to deal with is his talk about the curse of beauty and the myth of inspiration and the myth of genius. Now, what are some problems when it comes to art? First, he correctly critiques traditional aesthetic views that claim that beauty is what makes good art. Perhaps when you think of what makes good art, you might think of something that's attractive and beautiful to your eyes. But then maybe you forget to think about certain works of art that have had a political impact or that have stood against war. Seerveld gives good reasons for rejecting these myths because of their false conception of what occurs in the moment of artistic creation. He concludes that these myths, that it is beauty that makes good art, must be done away with because they stand in the way of students getting involved in the arts, and because people think that in order to be involved in the arts, for example, one must also be inspired in some mystical way. Your ordinary Dutch Reformed student is maybe not going to think that he's a genius, and therefore maybe it's impossible for him to be an artist. So let's look at some pseudo views of art, or pseudo-Christian views of art. Now, Seerveld is unimpressed by the way that some Christians support pseudo-Christian art. He discusses a situation where some Christian board members who were responsible for recommending what movies should be shown in the city of Cleveland allowed a movie that was made of Samson and Delilah to be shown in the city just because it involved a biblical story. Well, they rejected a movie that showed the trouble that a man experienced because of an adulterous act. So these naive board members considered the movie of Samson and Delilah to be Christian just because it followed a biblical story, while they rejected a movie that, according to Seerveld, probably had a more authentic Christian message about the sorrows and consequences of committing adultery. Another example of pseudo-Christian art was discovered by Seerveld in The Banner, which was a religious, and is a religious magazine periodical that the Christian Reformed Church publishes, and often had cartoons and then pictures of children and parents. And his problem was that he found that in the denominational magazine there were too many pictures of Christian families where the children and parents were model people. Why did this magazine feel the need to provide pictures of model Christians or model Christian families? Seerveld didn't think that this was realistic. It wasn't presenting what is actually the case. It's creating an imaginative world where the people, model Christians, are better than life. The pictures of Sunday school children, for example, are model children with never dirt behind their ears, who are artificial products, he says. They're pseudo-Christian. Christian art is not art that always tries to paint a rosy and wonderful picture of a happy Christian life with no problems. So a pseudo-Christian art is one that is idealistic. It's also defined by Seerveld to be art that is carrying the wrong message, or that just has a wrong idea of what Christian art is, like the idea that this Samson and Delilah film was somehow Christian art. Neither is the Christian art that Seerveld promotes like the artwork which has been done in the Roman Catholic Church historically. He says that the inner logic of Roman Catholic art is that Christian art is art useful to the church, and art useful to the church must be unambiguously catechetical. Seerveld is not interested in developing art for church buildings, although he understands there's room for that. Instead, he's looking for art that expresses the Christian world and life view from the personal experiences and insights of the Christian men and women who are artists. Seerveld, interestingly, talks about the curse of beauty. Whoever thought that a person talking about aesthetics would talk about the curse of beauty? He complains about what he calls the curse of beauty. Now, he has a problem with beauty as it was historically promoted because it was defended as the sole criterion that made a work of art good. Good art was said to be art that was beautiful. Now, we can do the same thing when it comes to music. When I hear some music that I don't like so much, I might say it's not good art. Or if I hear some Chinese traditional music, I might say that doesn't sound nice like Mozart. Now, the argument that Seerveld uses to argue against the traditional concept of beauty is interesting in that he attacks beauty with a capital B. Beauty inevitably brings with it mysticism. It always involves man in a blasphemous breakthrough in devotion, even if muted, to beauty itself as an undefined type of mediator. Seerveld thinks that beauty as a criterion for judgment, when it is viewed as something which exists autonomously, for example, as perhaps some sort of harmony, is a wrong conception of beauty because it, he says, misreads the divinity of God visible in creation. This reminds me of how, if you would have asked me as a graduate student, what is beauty, I probably would have tried to talk in terms of harmony. It's where, this part of a person's face is in harmony with that part of their face, or the color and the harmony of the colors. Well, it's very interesting that Seerveld challenges that notion. He thinks that beauty must be viewed as a sphere that is created by God and thus dependent upon Him for its value. Beautiful art is problematic in two ways. First, if it isn't beautiful, it's worthless. Think of how many important paintings aren't so beautiful. Second, if it is beautiful, then it can be accused, he says, of usurping attention and praise due to beauty itself alone. Seerveld wants to claim that good art is art that gets its value from other sources than the concept of beauty with a capital B that is detached from what art in the Christian sense should be like. Beautiful art is stretched on the rack of this dilemma. The curse of beauty is that it has led artists historically to have a wrong conception of good art because they had a wrong conception of beauty. Two other things besides beauty that have plagued artists historically are the myth of inspiration and the myth of genius, and Seerveld wants to do away with these. Plato was the philosopher responsible for creating the curse of beauty, says Seerveld. Aristotle is the person Seerveld accuses of beginning the myth of inspiration. He says Aristotle lifts art into the role of being a kind of high priest for the human race. So Aristotle completed Plato with a twist. making art the auricular mouthpiece of supreme beauty, divine mind. So according to Aristotle, art is an activity in which the supreme mind uses certain special men as instruments for creating works of art. Now, Seerveld dislikes this because it makes art into a divine work and not a human activity. This conflicts with some very basic presuppositions of Seerveld, one of which is his thesis that art is worship. Of course, he views worship as a human activity done for God's glory. Art, to be an act of worship, of course, must be a human activity. A practical problem with the myth of inspiration is that Aristotle's mystical view of how art is created is problematic because it leads artists and potential artists to the conclusion that they can work as hard as ever at their work, but in order for the work to be good, they need to have mystical moments of inspiration. And Seerveld wants to impress on artists and artistic students that their work is just like work in other fields. This reminds me of how some good writers have had to say to potential writers, good writing is 90% hard work and 10% inspiration. That is why some people are very naive when they talk as if writing is this wonderful, easy, fun, relaxing thing. No, writing is hard because writing involves hard thinking. So it is with artistic work. Artistic work involves toil. It's not like in every other kind of job, like as a carpenter, you work by the sweat of your brow. But if you're going to give yourself to artistic work, that somehow there's no hard work involved and there are no thorns to prick your fingers. No, Seerveld insists it is hard work that brings results, not some kind of mystical inspiration. Now, it's true that as Reformed Christians, we affirm that all artistic gifts come from God. In fact, in the Old Testament, we're told that certain men received wonderful artistic gifts from God so that they could work on the various things that were inside of the tabernacle. And our author also has things to say about Aholiab and Bezalel. So he takes issue with this idea of the myth of inspiration, that you can just be lazy and then somehow, without having to work hard, suddenly you will be able to produce a marvelous type of artistic thing. Also, Seerveld takes issue with the myth of genius, especially in the first part of the 20th century. And of course, in the 19th century as well, there were people pushing this idea of the myth of genius. There had been a history of people in the previous centuries viewing the artist as this marvelous genius. The myth of genius also was connected to some of the thought of men like Nietzsche, who believed in the supermen, of super special people who are of great genius, who could use their will to power. Well, that sort of idea was taken over into art too. Now, the myth of genius is related to the myth of inspiration, and that both of them have to do with the origin of the work of art. Seerveld never actually uses the phrase myth of genius like he does use myth of inspiration, but he thinks that the idea of the artist being a genius is a romanticist myth. The myth of inspiration presupposes that good art comes from the supreme mind, while the myth of genius says that the good art comes only from some rare and gifted mind that stands out far above the rest of the people in society. Seerveld, when he's actually speaking about the myth of genius, without using the words, he says, if we think artists by profession are creators, while mothers just have babies, we may be caught unwittingly in simply adapting, lightly Christianize the old 19th century idolatry of the artistic person as autonomous genius. The conception of artists as creator, something like a superstar next to ordinary mortals, will not be free from the evil romanticism that tends to elevate a given artist out of the bonds of community. Now, it's wrong to view the genius as an autonomous person because Seerveld thinks that the artist must be viewed as a part of a given community. The idea of a person being an autonomous genius, as if he's not impacted by his society or who stands above the community, is simply wrong because it elevates one person's mind in an unnatural way above the thoughts and influences of his context, his history, and his community. Seerveld thinks that Christian artistry can flourish only when the artist is deeply embedded both in an artistic community and in the wider societal communion of sinning saints. A person who's autonomous from this community will not then, according to Seerveld, be producing authentic Christian art. If you're not a living part of your community, a community of people who know they are sinners and imperfect, a community that knows that they're in need of redemption, a community that struggles to perceive the glory of God in his world, well, then there's going to be something lacking in your art. Now, if Seerveld is correct in assuming that the myth of genius views the genius as someone who's autonomous from a society, then he's correct in rejecting this notion. He thinks it is important to focus on the fact that the artist is working in a tradition and in a given society. So his output comes not only from his mind, but from the society that has shaped who he is. Now, the practical results of the myth of genius are also problematic because this lays burdens in the path of the student who is interested in the arts. Because how many people are geniuses? It's true that people can have big thoughts of themselves, and often students can have high dreams about their future. But if you think you need to be a genius to produce good art, well then the ordinary Christian will not be very hopeful. Seerveld wants to encourage students to get involved in the arts. He wants them to know that making art involves hard work and not some sort of abstract genius. We've now looked at a couple of the introductory thoughts of Seerveld. We've looked at his views on some wrong approaches to art, some of the problems with traditional views of beauty, and wrong ideas of art, like the myth of inspiration or the myth of genius, that can mess up and stand in the way of constructive artistic work. Next time we'll turn and we'll look at what this interesting thinker says about what is authentic Christian art.